All right, welcome to the fourth episode of Unsheathed. I am Kyell Gold.
And I am K.M. Hirosaki once again, calling in from a discreet, undisclosed location.
As am I this time. Neither of us is actually at home, which means we might both not be wearing pants.
Although it's worth pointing out that we're not in the same undisclosed location. And so,
Right,
if either of us is pantsless, neither of us knows for sure.
that's true. Only Kit would know for sure. Well,
Now you get me wondering if he's wearing pants.
That I'm not going to say. We are again on Skype, which is we apologize for the audio quality. A lot of people have told us that the quality for the third episode was better, and we have Kit to thank for that. But this time, sadly, we're back to headsets and Skype. So hopefully this won't be too much of a regular occurrence because we do enjoy recording together.
And this should be the last time we'll have to do it for a while as well. I can't think of anything in the near future that'll necessitate our doing it this way.
Well, I'm traveling to a couple of conventions, but so we'll see. Maybe one more time.
Well, I'm going to the same conventions you are. Oh, not all of them.
You're not going to Feral.
I'm not going to Feral, and I'm not going to anywhere overseas.
Right. But speaking of conventions, I've returned from Rocky Mountain Fur Con, and I'm pleased to say I had a wonderful time there. The hosts were quite gracious. We especially appreciated the efforts of Soren the chair to come and find myself and Kit because we were the only patrons who hadn't checked in as of the Friday cocktail party, and he wanted to make sure that all the patrons got the chance to get good and liquored up.
Is that the same Soren who does Frozen Oasis?
I don't know. I don't believe so, but I don't know that much about him other than that he chairs the convention here.
Okay. We mentioned Soren and you mentioned alcohol, so I was
It could be. I think he was talking about having mixed drinks, so...
Oh, there you go.
Perhaps.
It's worth pointing out I've not had an entire bottle of wine to myself this evening. I did have two beers with dinner, but that was about 2 hours ago by this point. And I was seriously considering stopping by a convenience store or a supermarket specifically to buy alcohol to drink for the podcast. But then I'm like, Kyell will be really mad if I do that. So.
Well, Kyle's a little bit sleep deprived at the moment, so alcohol might have put you on a par. I think you may have a little bit of an advantage over me this time. But at any rate,
that in so many ways.
At any rate, the convention was quite enjoyable. I signed on to Twitter for the first time this week, and we tweeted about an epic backgammon game with the Blotch, which I'll also post something about in my con report tomorrow.
Is that where you won Wisconsin?
I won the right not to have Wisconsin. Wisconsin was obliged to go to the loser.
Oh, it was the booby prize.
Yes, indeed. But as I will mention again tomorrow, I do believe that the Blotch is something of a backgammon sharp because after I should turn off anything with notifications here. Because after playing the first game, they said, "Well played. We should play the next game for money."
Because I'm sure that the Blotch does not have enough.
Well, you can never have enough. But it was quite fun. There were a lot of entertaining artists there, and a lot of good fans came up. I tried to list all of them, but special shouts out to Wu Wei, who hung out most of Saturday and chatted with us. Palmer Husky, your book is on the way. I accidentally sold a book that I told him I would hold for him and felt really bad about that, so we shipped it out today for him, and it's all signed and everything, so hopefully he gets that soon. And I'm trying to think. I met Skip Rudder and Rivka Fox from Bad Dog Books and Rabbit Valley, respectively, and had some nice chats with them. And in general, just enjoyed the city of Denver in the middle of summer. High Plains in summer wasn't as dry as I thought it would be, and wasn't as hot as we thought it would be. So Kit and I had a lovely time down there. We got to see a thunderstorm and um, came away from it quite enjoying the weekend.
I'm also going to point out to our listeners, I think that's the only time you'll hear Kyell commenting on how glad he is that something wasn't hotter.
And only about the weather.
Only.
And possibly about people that Kit is staying with when I'm not around.
Ambiguously pantsless or no.
Yes, indeed. But we've been getting a lot of emails in, and a lot of them, some very good questions. So we're anxious to kind of get down to them.
And so let us begin those forthwith. Our first one here is from Roran. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. He writes that he is a red fox. He dabbles in a few different arts, including writing, short stories which never see the light of day, and poetry that does get posted from time to time. Photography, doodling, that sort of thing. He notes that he is not very confident in his work, namely because he has trouble figuring out exactly how to improve. He says, I heard that the best way to get one's work looked at by many people and to get their feedback is to get one's work looked at by many people and get their feedback, but as an amateur, distinctly lacking in fame, I don't get my work looked at very often, even when I do put things on the internet. So, is there a place wherein I can submit my work to be reviewed, critiqued, etc.? And I think that this right here is actually one of the sort of sticking points when it comes to writing and things online, especially in the fandom. Because you do have sites like Furry and whatnot where you can post your work as writing, but when people are browsing through that, just sort of hitting through a short story and sitting and devoting the time to that usually isn't within someone's time budget. Like, people don't just sort of casually pick through stories usually.
Right. Yeah, and people tend to read stories from authors they already know.
Exactly.
Because it's a bigger time commitment than just looking at a picture.
Right, exactly. Yeah, a much bigger one. And again, yeah, so you usually will distinctly go either, okay, I'm going to go look for stories to read, or, oh, hey, so-and-so posted a new story, I should check that out.
And generally, if people won't leave detailed critiques on Fur Affinity either. They'll leave, I like the story, you should write more, or you should write a sequel, or if they didn't like it, they just won't leave anything.
Or they'll just say, Mer.
Yeah. Mer Central, I believe.
Mer Central. I wish that's where my discreet, undisclosed location was. K.M. Hirosaki coming at you directly from Mer Central.
I think Mer Central is wherever a fox is.
Well, then I'm clearly not there.
So you just have to find a fox.
Now I really wish I were there.
Oh.
But yeah, so as far as just submitting things for critique, I know there are a few communities on LiveJournal that are out there, but most of those are for fan fiction and that sort of thing. And my experience with that is just sort of dropping original furry fiction in there isn't going to get you looked at very closely, because people who offer to review fan fiction want to read stories from a particular fandom, for whatever book series or TV series that people are writing about. Pretty much the only people who are going to want to read furry stories are furries, which makes it a little more tricky.
There's a writers' forum on Fur Affinity where writers hang out and kind of talk back and forth to each other, and that's a good place to kind of get to know some of the other writers in the fandom, and you can ask them, I'm having this kind of trouble with my story, or I wonder if some people would have the time to go and take a look at this story and see what you'd suggest for me to get better. There's also a website called Critique Circle, CritiqueCircle. I don't remember if there's a dash in between them, but if you just Google Critique Circle, you should come up with the website. And that is specifically for people to submit work and get critique, but be warned that you also have to give critique in order to be a member of the community. And that's usually going to be the case anyway.
In other words, you should be able to give it as good as you can take it.
Exactly. Which is a good rule for anything, actually. The other thing that you can do is, this is something that you're going to need to develop as a writer anyway. Go back and, we tell people this all the time, but read the works that you admire and kind of try to read your own work as critically as you read other people's work. It's really hard to do because you get very close to the story, but if you read enough of professionally published authors, and not just fan fiction, but real high quality work that's out there, and then go back and read your own stuff, just play with it, and don't be afraid to steal devices and tricks of dialogue that you pick up in these published books, because everybody starts out by stealing a little bit from the people they admire, and eventually you sort of make a collage of the things you like best from all the people you like best, and that becomes your style. And then as you get more confident with that, you become able to experiment and play around and really sort of make up some of your own tricks. But that might help as much or more than just having your friends look at it or having other people look at it and tell you what's missing.
Yeah, and again, sort of, as opposed to just, oh, hey, can I just dump a bunch of work online and have it critiqued and reviewed? I think the stuff that we had been talking about before in previous episodes about having, if not even an official workshop, just like even a group of like 2-3 people that you can pass work out to, email it to them, have it look at.
Yep.
You're not going to have as many people looking at it, but after a certain point, you only really need so many people to look at something before you really get an idea of what does and doesn't work. That sort of thing becomes apparent really quickly.
Yeah, absolutely right. Do you want to go on to the second question?
Yes. You had something. You were saying something earlier that was about to dovetail nicely, but then we actually had more to say, so I will let you speak. He says, on an entirely unrelated note, there's our segue. I was wondering if you had any advice concerning the use of commas, semicolons, and parentheses. I employ all of the aforementioned in my writing with gusto, as you should, because those are part of English writing. I feel like my work is more coherent when the entirety of a single thought is in a sentence.
And I think that's a really interesting... I'm sorry, I think that's a really interesting proposition, but go on, and that's not the actual question.
Yeah. It says, however, I've noticed that in the book I'm currently reading, the author's comma usage frequently causes me to backtrack and reread sentences. My question is, which do you consider more important, thought coherency or ease of readability? Now, I personally would maintain that if you are writing your thoughts with coherence, then ease of readability will follow naturally.
Yeah, I would think so.
Ideally, it should, at least.
Ideally, that would be the case. Yeah, I don't think that you should really have to choose between the two, but I think the cardinal rule that each writer has to keep in mind is that you want in most cases, some experimental fiction aside, you want the reader to, on some level, forget that they're reading a story. You want them to lose themselves in the experience. And that's why good grammar, good punctuation, good spelling is all important, because anything that makes the reader kind of pause and have to do work to figure out what's going on, just what the words in the sentence mean or what a sentence means, interrupts the story and breaks the flow.
Right. And a lot of, I don't want to say amateur writers like it's a bad thing, but folks who have
beginning writers,
there we go. Folks who have just started to begin to write seriously and have obviously begun to recognize their own skill and talent and are starting to put stories out there, I tend to see a lot of really long, complex sentences in their writing. It's almost sort of like a look at how long and complex a grammatically correct sentence I can create kind of feeling to it.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times it just sort of seems sort of like linguistic gymnastics, where it's like go through all these hoops to read this sentence and then like be amazed at the fact that it made sense. And I mean, like, I don't think that that's really, like he says, if you have to go and backtrack and reread sentences, then it's probably either, written too obscurely or, could probably be simplified. Actually, an example that just came up last week I was talking about was there's this thing I've been needing to go over or something in an unrelated context, but it involves there's this text sample. It's the first 2 pages of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, and just having to go over that repeatedly, just the brevity and clarity of the language is really impressive. I mean, it's very short, distinct sentences, but they're not like dumbed down, and it's not like simple and boring. It's very clear and concise, and it creates really strong and vivid mental imagery. And it's one of those things where, if something, I mean, that was written over 100 years ago by this point, if I recall correctly, and it's something that, obviously people who are still alive today are still very familiar with, which says something about sort of the staying power of what was created.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of people sort of get into this, making overly complicated sentences, and there's a whole school of thought that talks about the beautiful sentences as opposed to plot and story, which I don't quite hold with, but that's a whole discussion for another time. But one of the important things as you're writing sentences too is not just the thought coherency, but the cadence and the rhythm of the sentences really contributes to the ease of readability. And if you have a lot of really long joined together sentences, the reader doesn't have time to take a figurative breath. But by the same token, if you have a lot of very short, choppy sentences, that gives a completely different feel to the work. And those are actually variables that you can use to affect the feel of the work and the pacing of it as you're writing it. And we could do written examples of how the same scene could play out in 2 different ways based on simply on how the sentences are constructed, which would kind of be interesting. But I think to a certain extent, although as I said, I don't really hold with the beautiful sentences school of writing, I do think that even writing prose has a little element of poetry to it, and you should definitely read your sentences out loud and see how they sound to your ears before you finalize your draft. That's a step. At least read it aloud in your head, but reading it out loud, with hearing the sound of your voice saying them really makes a difference. And you can always tell then if something sounds too awkward or something's awkwardly constructed, and just gotta try to control that.
Resist the urge to give in to your hatred in the dark side and whatnot.
Indeed.
So I hope we have answered that.
I think we certainly answered something. We blathered on long enough.
That's good. I mean, it was a set of legitimate questions with detailed answers.
Oh, it was actually.
Yeah. And I will pass the next question off onto you.
All right. Our next question comes, it's not really a question, but comes from the illustrious NotTube, whose story was featured in X along with myself and Hirosaki-san.
7 other wonderful writers.
And 7 other wonderful writers. Available from SofaWolf Press at sofawolf.com. NotTube writes, "It's a little known fact that I consider myself something of a writer as well, albeit not one nearly as dedicated and experienced as your literary personages. However, with my few modest credentials tucked under my belt, I found myself listening to the 2nd episode of your new podcast and itching to weigh in on the discussion." NotTube is very modest, of course. For example, during the discussion on how long a short stories ought to be, I would have liked to have added that, while you and K.M. are certainly correct in your answer that they ought to be as long as they need to be, very often as long as they need to be is shorter than the author thinks. In the natural process of writing, we tend to spill the thoughts from our heads as they emerge, but trimming, condensing, and focusing the content makes it richer, more fulfilling, and more rewarding to reread. That's a very good use of the rule of threes, by the way. And he
Mm-hmm.
says he's not a considerable writer. The editing process should ideally involve more taking out than adding, I think. Reduction always enhances the flavor. I agree with both you and K.M. that it's important not to focus too much on the importance of what you're writing. Concern over the quality of the writing can hamstring a writer. The internal critic is the enemy of creativity. As long as you're letting that critic have your attention, you'll never be able to flow creatively to get into that deliriously happy groove that is the best part of writing a story. And he adds, also, the comma equals pause thing is way off. This trips up so many writers. A pause often indicates a comma, but not always. I'm going to take a little bit of an issue with that last one and say that a pause frequently indicates a comma, and that part of the reason it trips up writers is that people speak incorrectly and don't put pauses into sentences where they should, where there are commas. But that said, he's right. A pause is not always a comma. However, I think what I replied to him, I believe, was if a beginning writer is unsure about whether to put a comma or not, speaking the sentence out loud and seeing if there is a pause at that point in the sentence is usually a good guide if no other guide is available to them.
I agree. I think that's a fair guideline. And, if you're the sort of person that doesn't, or, is unsure about that sort of, punctuation placement, then you should have editors look at your stuff.
Yep. But, even better is to learn the rules. I mean, if you have a misplaced comma here and there or a missing comma here and there, that's not a big deal. But I've read manuscripts that had that literally I could not force myself to finish because the commas and the punctuation mistakes were just almost literally in every sentence.
Yeah.
And it just got too much.
Really, it comes down to read published work, see how those people use commas, copy that.
Exactly. And I think he makes a good point too about the story being shorter than the author thinks. I will say that there are as many different techniques of writing and editing as there are writers and editors. Knot tubes is certainly one of the more common you hear about, where you take out more than you add in the editing process. I find myself that my first drafts tend to be almost usually tend to be a little bit shorter than the final, because I will be writing a scene and I'll just get down the basics of the scene and then I want to jump on to the next one. And so usually when I go back, I'll notice that, oh, hey, I didn't really make clear why they're having this conversation here, or, what sparked this person to say this remark, or what, made them leave. And I'll end up having to fill in around the skeleton of the first draft.
Yeah.
But part of that is I'm just going to say, sorry, part of that is because I do kind of involve my internal editor in my creativity. And that might not always be the best way to go. I think it does make my first drafts a little bit slow, but at the same time, that's how I write.
Way faster than I do.
Well, what works for me might not work for you. Find what works for you, and don't worry about what works for anyone else.
My overall writing process is very similar to yours, though, I think, in that I'll write a first draft, I will take a bunch of stuff out, and then put more back in than I took out, so my final draft will end up a little bit longer. So sort of rip out the crap, put in better stuff, and then add spackle. And so the end result is a little bit longer than what I started with.
Yeah, mine ends up being a lot of spackle. Um, but anyway, we're very glad that NotTube decided to write in and contribute, because we always value his opinion.
As opposed to Tube, that guy's a jerk.
Yeah. Okay, so again, thank you for the email, and Hirosaki.
Okay, this one is from Confused, who I got to hang out with a bit at Anthrocon a month or so ago. It's a fellow literary bent type person.
Yep.
Says, "Hey there, guys. I had a couple of questions for the podcast about editing. Specifically, I was wondering how the two of you worked with editors. When you send a story off for beta reading or for submission to a publication, what do you get back? Do your editors make notes suggesting every change, or do they actually make changes in the manuscript? In making changes, where does an editor step over the line in being too hands-on? I would presume that grammatical issues, such as spelling, punctuation, etc., would be okay for editors to correct, but what about plot continuity issues, word choices, or even major plot changes? Are there some circumstances where it's more or less acceptable for editors to dig down and root around in the content of the story? I'm hoping you have some amusing anecdotes to share from your own publishing careers, even if they only became amusing in retrospect. I know it's a big topic, but I'd love to hear your opinions and some stories on what makes a good editor and what boundaries they should observe, if any." And that's actually an interesting question, because I think people are under the impression that editors are more hands-on than they are. There's a difference between copy editing, which is correcting mistakes, and getting actual editorial feedback. To answer what I think is the general question is, how much does the editor get to change? By themselves, not much. Unless it's fixing mistakes, editors will not typically change your story. They might suggest things for you to change, but they're not going to go in there and actually send you back a copy of your story where they've altered the ending so that things happen a different way. That's not the editor's job. And if your editor is trying to do that, get a new editor.
Or just politely change it back and say, I liked it the way it was. Yeah, there's an editor is generally permitted to go in and do copy editing. I think anything beyond that, when I was working on editing X, I restricted myself to saying, if I thought there was a problem with the story, I would say, I think you need to strengthen this character's motivation. I think that you need to punch up the dialogue a little bit. I think this scene may be not necessary. But I'd always explain why. I wouldn't, you never say, I think you should cut out this scene, period, end of sentence. You would say, I think you need to cut out this scene because in the overall character arc, you want to focus on this person, and this scene kind of distracts you from that storyline. It takes the reader away from the main thrust of the story. It's a really nice scene, but it doesn't contribute, it doesn't move the story forward. And that's usually the reason to get rid of any scene, is if it doesn't move the story forward.
Yeah, one thing that any writer should know is why they're writing what they're writing and why they're not writing what they're not writing.
Exactly. And, that would be about as far as I would go. I wouldn't, in a couple cases, if a word was clearly the wrong word, if the word's a typo, you can go ahead and change it. If the word is clearly the wrong word, but you're not sure if they meant it, I would just note it and say, do you mean this other word? Or if you can't think of what they might mean, just say, I don't understand what this means.
Right.
But always try to be constructive and helpful as an editor. Don't say, don't just send something back and say, you need to make this story better. Say, I think this is lacking in the area of dialogue, or I really like the characters and the dialogue, but I don't have any sense of where they are, so you need to put in some more description.
Right.
Little things like that.
Yeah. To answer the question of what you actually get back from the editor, typically you'll get a copy of your story back, sort of as a changes document. Office and other programs like that will usually let you document changes that are made, and those will usually be of the copy editing variety with comments inserted at various points. A lot of programs let you do that as well. And in that, the editor will probably include, probably in the email that they send you with the attachment, their more laid out editorial feedback. Stuff like, hey, I think that, I like the overall flow. I think that maybe this part of the story goes a little quickly. I don't understand at this point why he doesn't just fuck Gareth when there's totally a reason for him to. Which I guess that falls into a funny editing story. A very specific example where I sent a first draft of one of my stories to Kyell here, and he goes, I don't understand why he doesn't just have sex with him at this point. And so I had to go back and edit the story and create a reason why he couldn't just have sex with him. He's like, how? It's like, I would have done it. And I'm like, yeah, I would have done it too. So I'm like, okay, now I need to come up with a reason why he wouldn't do it.
Exactly.
So it's that sort of thing. So it helped the story. Now the reader doesn't need to be bewildered of why isn't he fucking this coyote? I would be fucking the coyote.
No, you'd be down on your knees in front of the coyote.
Again. Okay. That's right. We haven't. Did we seriously? We've gotten like a half hour in before we had our first blowjob reference.
I know. I had to force that in somehow.
Oh my god. See, okay, I think we take turns flustering each other week after week. This week is your opportunity to fluster me.
I'm taking unfair advantage of poor Mr. Hirosaki-san.
Oh, if it was that unfair, I'd just disconnect
and then I'd be left to wrap up the podcast with a little tap dance. And due to technical difficulties, Hirosaki-san has gone to take his pants off, and I'm left here all alone.
But yeah, so my actual other amusing anecdote about my own publishing career, as Confused asked, involving editors. There was, I won't get into specifics, I won't name names, I won't say which story, but there was a publication I submitted a story to many, many, many moons ago, and the editor got back to me and was like, I love your story, I think the story's great, there's nothing wrong with it, it's just that your story has a downbeat ending, and none of the other stories that I'm going to be looking at do, so can you make your ending happier to match those? And my response was, if I'm going to do that, then I'm not writing with respect to my own story. I'm writing to match something that isn't even what I'm writing. So I'm like, look, this is the ending that the story should have. You seem to recognize that on the story's own individual merits. If it doesn't fit, don't take the story. But I'm not going to change the story to fit what other people are writing that doesn't even connect back to it. And in the end, I won out on that argument, so... Put your foot down.
Yay for you.
See, I can be bossy and dominant sometimes. See?
Yeah, you can. I never doubted that.
Forceful otter.
Yeah, I don't know that I have any editing stories really to share. Mostly the editors I've been fortunate enough to work with have been really good, and the few experiences that I've had that have been less than satisfactory, I don't think I really want to talk about in public. There's nothing.
I hope I wasn't airing out too much dirty laundry.
No. There's nothing particularly amusing about the experiences either. It all sort of falls into the category of what we were talking about before, where the editor returns something to you and they've changed things in the story that should be the prerogative of the writer to change.
Right. Now, if the editor had gone ahead and changed the ending of my story without telling me and published it in that form, that would be something where you'd have an issue.
Yeah, that would be pretty bad.
Send a bunch of ninja mice to end their life discreetly.
But thank you for that question. That's actually a really good one. And working with editors is, of course, a hopefully integral part of any writer's life. Otherwise, you're just sitting publishing your stuff on the web for yourself and whoever comes to see you. And so, it's important to know that while editors do have boundaries as well, and although you may be so excited at getting one of your first few stories published that you kind of feel like the editor has all the power and you have to kind of do whatever they say, that's not necessarily true. you have the power because it's your story. And if the editor's suggesting something and you think, oh, it doesn't feel right, but I kind of really want to get in the magazine, so I guess I'll do it. Think about what you're doing. I'm not saying that's the wrong thing to do. If you really want to get your first publication out there, but be aware that you don't have to.
You could always just give the editor a blowjob.
That might work as well. In lieu of the changes you suggest.
In lieu of the changes, I will also accept carnal delights.
But anyway,
I'm not an editor. I'd be getting myself into trouble.
Yes, you find plenty of ways to get yourself into trouble anyway.
Hanging around with you always.
Well, we do our best. So I think we're sort of right around our time limit. We do have a bunch of letters to try to get through, so we'll try to do this again as soon as we can. Hopefully we'll be back in the same disclosed location next week, and we can sit down and do this one more time. Not
and maybe
only
Kid can ply me with wine again.
Yes, not only one more time. He does
have a nice one.
But
Yeah, he does have a nice wine collection, by the way.
He does. But anyway, thanks again for listening. Hopefully it wasn't too bad this time with the Skype and all. And saying good night, this is Kyell Gold.
And this is K.M. Hirosaki. Alcohol-free.